Hello and welcome to today's lecture series. This is going to be the last in this semester's series of lectures and assignments on history of classical art. And I'm going to be looping back around today to some of the topics that we were discussing in the very early days of this semester when we were still meeting in our cramped classroom in person. And that is the way that the art and culture of the ancient Mediterranean world was interpreted and responded to by later generations of people and continues to be relevant today as people continue to interpret the stories, the culture, the history, the artistic styles of these periods. So you will see in each of my header slides today collections of examples of ways in which contemporary and later artists of various genres, from museum curators to authors, as you see here, to video game designers, have interpreted the ancient world, used themes from the ancient world in creating new works. So not all of them are things that I have actually experienced myself, so if there's anything really super rotten in there, it's not my fault, unless that is this book here, New Pompeii, which is one of my all-time favorites, unashamedly, even though it is completely ridiculous. So with that in mind, today I'm going to be starting our first lecture with discussing the transmission, preservation, and the change that happens in perception of ancient cultures through those processes over time. And I'm going to be starting out bringing you back to one of our tangled timelines from the earliest part of the semester, where we saw that the ancient cultures around the Mediterranean world were interacting with one another, competing with one another, and eventually started to sort of coalesce and synthesize and hybridize and interpenetrate one another and come together, eventually coalesced underneath the umbrella of the Roman Empire, which is a very diverse, large geographic area in this ancient area. So although our lines get simplified here, it's important to remember that the sort of multiculturalism of the ancient world doesn't go away. It all just starts to exist even more closely together, often in tension. Now, with the decline in influence and slow dissolution of the Roman Empire, which begins with the East-West split as far back as the 4th century, we start to see these squiggly lines of multicultural contestation over geographic space and lots of different intercultural contact coming once again into the fore. And that's not to say that there wasn't a lot of other cultures coexisting with the Roman Empire, just that the Mediterranean area was largely under their control for a long period. But we see later on, up until the 20th century and 21st century, a great deal of smaller entities contesting for this region and control and influence over the area. And different larger entities from farther away, like the Mongolian Empire that we see coming over into the European sphere in the sort of 1300s and 1200s. So I want to emphasize, though, the fact that classical reception and the sort of process of interpreting the past as it pertains to the ancient Mediterranean began as far back as our ancient periods. So one of the time periods in which we see an awful lot of that going on is the Hellenistic period. So we see Alexander the Great, for example, as an example of a character who in his immediate history, right, so here we have a gold coin of one of his successor kings, Lysimachus, is interpreted as a sort of a figure that can take on multiple cultural characteristics depending on what you need him for, right? So I want to emphasize the sort of flexibility in interpretation that occurs when you're dealing with historical figures. And we can see this process even playing out in antiquity. So Alexander the Great is this great Hellenistic hero, right? But he is also, in his legacy, interpreted through multiple lenses that differ somewhat from the way that we might learn about him, say, in elementary school as a Greek, right? Not even a Macedonian oftentimes. He's represented just as a Greek. So in this stater, we can see him represented with these ram's horns, which tend to be interpreted as illustrating his connection with Zeus Ammon, which is an Egyptian oracular deity that Alexander the Great visited the oracle of during one of his visits to Egypt. So in this time period, we see him interpreted as someone who marries Persian women and is accepted as a legitimate successor to the Persian king Darius III. We see him incorporating aspects of Egyptian and Greek deities. And so he becomes this sort of template on which you can place a lot of different cultural aspects depending on your interpretative needs in this time. Now, in the centuries following the death of Alexander the Great, we see his historical records start to take on these mythological accretions, and it grows into this collection of tales which is known as the Alexander Romance, which is, believe it or not, I'm sure you've probably never heard of it because who has, but it is one of the most read and most printed, most translated, and most transmitted texts of the history of textual sources. So it sort of has its beginning roots around 200 to 300 CE, probably, although it is attributed to the official historian of Alexander the Great, Callisthenes. So it seems to also maybe draw on the historical core of a contemporary source from the life of Alexander the Great. But by the time that we have examples of manuscript traditions of this story, it has taken on really strong mythological connotations. Alexander the Great meets winged, bearded women in the far northeast realms of the empire. He fights with various demons and mythological creatures. He encounters all sorts of people in situations that are highly fantastical. I recommend it. It's quite short and a really quick read and very entertaining. So the Alexander Romance is fun. But it is also one of these texts that we have a lot of examples of, and we see the ways in which later authors and illustrators and writers, particularly in the manuscript tradition, one of the most important ways that we have transmission of literary sources from the ancient world, could interpret, illustrate, and use the figure of Alexander the Great, sort of continuing on the way that antique successors of him, his empire, did. They could use him as a way of expressing ideas about their contemporary society as well. So here we have one example of a manuscript that shows a scene of Alexander the Great visiting King Darius III on his deathbed, his sick bed. And we have Alexander basically using what is similar to a blessing gesture, and Darius giving him the go-ahead, the gesture of, yes, absolutely, I let you be my legitimate successor to my throne, as you have just beat me in battle and now I am too ill to survive. So we see this scene playing out as one between two kings of the medieval era. So the idiom of the artistic language here is highly medieval. The architecture is medieval. The costuming is medieval. These people are ethnically look Flemish, which is the region in which this manuscript was created. So we have a way in which this Alexander Romance, as the story is told through time, becomes a way that we can see stylistic differences play out very clearly, because we are working from a sort of singular template. And seeing the ways in which individual artists and also cultures on a sort of broader scale interact and respond to this singular text. One example of this is on my next slide here. Alexander the Great also becomes an Islamic hero and is interpreted as the character Iskandar, who acts as a sort of early mythological hero and is incorporated into Ferdowsi's Book of Kings, so the epic poem of the history of Iran that was written around the turn of the 11th century, 10th century, so around 1000. So we have him incorporated as well, as we see the legitimate successor of Darius, but also incorporated into the mytho-historical past of Persia and represented in illuminated manuscripts of this other heroic text as well. Here visiting the Brahmins in India, as Alexander the Great made it all the way to India. And we can see that ethnically here. He appears to, again, match the authors of the text. And so we have him interpreted into yet another cultural lens. And this is another huge rabbit hole that you should feel free to run down. It's fascinating to see the way that the history of Alexander the Great gets interpreted through so many different cultural lenses, and his activities change based on what he is considered to be doing and where he is considered to be from in this case. And here's just two more examples of Iskandar, Alexander the Great, as seen through this Islamic perspective. So Alexander the Great is not the only historical figure who becomes a kind of template on which people can play out different ideas through history. Another one is Julius Caesar. And he likewise, during his own time period, is looking back at Alexander the Great and attempting to sort of emulate his idea of who this historical figure was. So as we see in Plutarch's Life of Caesar, in the quote that I have on the screen, Alexander the Great is said to have wept when he was reading about the life, Julius Caesar is said to have wept when he was reading about the life of Alexander the Great, because Alexander, by Caesar's age at that time, had already accomplished so much, and Caesar had seen himself. He was governor of the province of Spain at the time as having done nothing of consequence. So we see him taking this inspiration, and it becomes another legend in the life of Caesar, the way that he sort of interpreted Alexander the Great's early success as a drive to accomplish more things. And we can see historically where that brings Caesar as a character. He is also one of these mytho-historical, he really is mytho-historical figures who ends up having a lengthy manuscript tradition. So his Bellum Gallicum is one of these texts that we have manuscripts for, and you see the way that monks and also Islamic scholars would copy over these Latin ancient texts over time and take the time to doodle in the margins and also to illustrate and beautify the text to give it a sort of importance, render it special. Not that the work involved in merely copying a text by hand isn't already really impressive. So Caesar, we see a lot of illuminated manuscripts in which we get images associated with him. We also see him interpreted through a medieval lens. So here he has on armor that is sort of the early Renaissance period, more appropriate to that period than the Romans. And we also see another example of the Bellum Gallicum, so the commentaries on the Gallic War of Caesar, taking on this medieval idiom and really interpreting these scenes from the life of Julius Caesar through a medieval lens. So I wanted to just take these two examples and briefly outline them for you. So on the left, we have Caesar sending a message to Pompey. And this is an interesting scene to depict. Here we have a wonderful single point perspective, Renaissance style. We have this lovely spare architectural space that is really very Renaissance-y as well. We have this landscape fading off into the distance, and we have our figures here, our Roman historical figures represented in medieval garb, with Caesar in this highly identifiable orange outfit, standing out from the rest and with his armor underneath. So one thing that is interesting about this scene is that it shows, it depicts an episode that is outside the story. It does not match the part of the story that is actually being told here. So it's from the historical life of Caesar, but not related to the section of the Gallic War that is being narrated here. So we have a sort of interesting mixture of genre between illustration of a historical biography and copying over of the words of Caesar himself. And similarly here we have Caesar about to depart in ships for Britain. So we have our very Roman looking ships here heading off to Britain. We have our very Roman looking city with its medieval bell tower, all of these medieval figures. So in our next, Next slide, I have two more images for you, the assassination of Julius Caesar and the surrender by the Belgae of the keys to their city to Caesar. And I would like you to do a little bit of an art historical interpretation of these as your to-do. So choose one of the scenes that are on the previous slide, use the image as a jumping off point, and write 3 to 4 sentences on your initial thoughts about the ways that ancient cultures get translated through the process of their transmission through time, right? So what does it mean to sort of see the ancient world through a medieval idiom in these illuminated manuscripts? And what does that mean for us as the receptors of this manuscript tradition as our primary way of accessing the literary world of the ancient Romans? Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next lecture.